Welcome to the CovidComplete Week in Review for the data and forecasts for the week ending January 29th, 2021. As is our usual practice, this review will focus on U.S. National and state level data, focus on understanding data, talk about what we've learned and what we can forecast, therefore, for the future. This is a politics-free discussion, really just focused on understanding what the data is and what it means in terms of the progression of the pandemic. The summary for this week is it's all good news, and beyond that, it seems likely to get better. So it's nice to be able to actually deliver this kind of a message this week. Let's dive in and see how that looks. The first thing we'll look at is the review of past forecasts and give you an update on what the forecast looks like going forward. In terms of the forecast that I submitted to the CDC as part of CovidComplete 2 Mondays ago, that forecast is tracking well. The first week error was a little high at 11.4%, but at this point, almost at the end of the 2-week period, we're down to 6.5%. So I consider anything under 10% to be good, and so that's tracking quite well. The forecasts that I submitted this most recent Monday are looking even better. The error after 6 days is only 2.3%, so that's looking pretty good as well. Looking ahead, the forecasts for the next few weeks are significantly down compared to what they have been. I have next week's death forecast down about 4,000 versus this week's, so that's really good news. Down to around 18,000 next week versus 22,000 this week. I think it's good to remember that we get leading indicators of what deaths are going to be at least a couple of weeks ahead of time. And so the news that we have seen about deaths being high this week, of course, that's terrible, but really maybe what is room for encouragement is that the positive test numbers are down so much. So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at the background and data highlights, and I'll give you some reasons why my forecasts show the improvement that they do. I always start by looking at the raw data, but then I quickly move on to the smooth data because the raw data is so noisy. If we take a look at the smooth data, the blue area is the positive test number and the red area is the deaths number. And if you look at that deaths number, it looks pretty flat, or the deaths graph looks pretty flat. But the blue graph is the positive test graph is headed sharply down. Since about January 10th, those positive tests have just been plummeting, and we are now down to about 140 positive tests per day, down from a peak of 240,000 per day just about 3 weeks ago. So that is definitely moving in the right direction. The second thing I take a look at is basically the relationship between the positive tests and the deaths, lining up the deaths so that they correspond to the earlier positive tests that could have predicted them. And what we see in this graph is if you look at the red area, or the pink area, that's the deaths, and they're fairly flat for 2 or 3 weeks. But if we then go down and look at the black line, that's the case fatality rate, and that's been pretty flat at around 1.4% for quite a while now. We had some dips in that around the holidays, basically due to reporting issues, but again, pretty flat around 1.4%. And what that means is that as the positive tests drop so precipitously that we can expect going forward that the deaths will also drop precipitously as they follow that decrease in the positive tests. Now, the orange line on this graph is the positivity number. That is the percentage of tests that come back positive. In general, we want to see that positivity number to be small. A small positivity number suggests that we're doing enough testing to catch a high percentage of cases, and the positivity number had been pretty high. We'd been up over 30% briefly, but now it's down around 20%. And so that's definitely moving in the right direction. That really provides more confirmation that, in fact, we're not just testing less and therefore seeing fewer positive cases. We're seeing fewer positive cases or fewer positive tests because there truly are fewer positive cases, and that's good news. More confirmation is I look at this graph, and this just shows the relationship between positive tests and total tests. The total tests are the gray area, and they look smaller than the positive tests because their axis is multiplied by a factor of 10. Basically, if the light blue area is below the gray area, that means that we've got a positivity of less than 10%. If the light blue area is higher, then we have positivity higher than 10%. Right now, the light blue area is about double the gray area, and so that means that positivity is running about 20%, which is not great, but it's better than it has been. The next graph I look at is this one, which is it takes the delta of the positive tests for the preceding 7 days compared to the 7-day period before that. Green means that the positive test number is down week over week. Red means the positive test number is up. As you can see from the graph, positive tests have been sharply down for a couple of weeks now, and that is more confirmation that all of this data, all of these trends are moving in the right direction. The final graph that I'll present is really the most complicated graph that I produce, but it's worth taking a little bit of time to look at the details here. The dotted blue line is the positive test line, and if you look at the right side of the graph, you can see again that positive test number peaked around January 10th and has been dropping sharply since then. The next line I look at is the gray line, which is the total test line, and what I don't want to see is that gray line dropping before the positive test line does, because that would mean the positive tests are dropping because we're testing less. In this case, the drop in the gray line actually slightly lagged the drop in the positive test line, which means that we just weren't finding as many cases, and so we started testing less. That's really what we want to see. So that's more confirmation of the good news. If we look at the dashed pink line, that's the hospitalization line, and that peaked shortly after the positive test line did, which is what you would expect. But it's also been dropping fairly rapidly since then. And so that really just provides more confirmation that positive tests are down, total tests are also down, but really as a response to positive tests being down and hospitalizations are down. And so even though deaths look fairly flat on this graph, we can expect deaths to soon follow the direction that these other lines have been going. Let's turn now to some of the state highlights and see what's going on at the individual state level. I have been looking at this particular diagram for most of the pandemic. Unlike the other state charts that I will present, this one is sorted from west to east, left to right. This has been a really useful diagram for tracking the regional aspects of the pandemic over the course of the pandemic. And really the main takeaway from this graph is that the test numbers are improving everywhere, really improving across the board, almost no exceptions. And we see the biggest improvements in the states that had the highest per capita test rates. So if you look at the top part of the graph, those are the states that are moving the most quickly downward. That's exactly what we would really ideally like to see, and really no exceptions to that general pattern. Now that graph is on a per capita basis. The next graph is on a total test basis, and if we look at that graph, what we see is that the orange bars represent where the state was last week with its positive tests, or for the period from 8 to 14 days ago. The blue bars represent the last 7 days, or most recent 7 days. And what we really want to see is we want to see the blue bars below the orange bars, and that means that the state is moving in the right direction. And so in this case, we see some really significant and positive movement. We see, in particular, California, really significant movement in the right direction in California. Arizona, which obviously has been hit hard over the course of the pandemic, also moving in a good direction. Florida, New York, Texas, all of these bigger states look quite good. The only real exception to this picture is New Jersey, where it's actually gotten a little bit worse. But I'm not seeing that really as that significant a movement at this point in time. Not ideal for the residents of New Jersey, but it's not as though there's a huge spike. It's really just more, I would say, static. If we look at the open readiness scores that I give the states, we're seeing something kind of interesting that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later in the talk. And that is that we've seen a week ago, this graph was nearly entirely red. Now we actually are seeing some orange and yellow. And on this depiction, 1s are the worst score, meaning the state's the least ready to open, and then 10 would be the highest. Hawaii's at 5 right now, but that's the best score that we currently have. In the continental U.S., the highest score is 3. And interestingly enough, the 3s seem to be clustered in the north midwestern states that had really were hit the hardest a couple of months ago, and now seem to be recovering the fastest. So we'll dive into that and kind of try to figure out what's happening there in a few minutes. Then turning finally to death forecasts in the state level. Again, this is basically good news almost across the board. Alabama, I'm forecasting a decrease compared to where they were the last period. Same thing in Arizona, a decrease. California, I'm forecasting a big decrease. Florida, decrease. Georgia, decrease. Illinois and Indiana, decreases. Pennsylvania, another decrease. Tennessee and Texas, also decreases. Really, there are only 2 exceptions to what I'm seeing in terms of decreases at the state level, and those exceptions are New York, where I'm forecasting a slight increase, and also Virginia, where I'm also forecasting a slight increase. Other than that, the picture looks really good, really across the board. So the issue of the week, the last thing I'd like to talk about this week is why are infections decreasing? It's interesting because when we look at this open readiness map, what we're seeing is it almost looks like a weather pattern with the states in the middle of the country, the northern middle of the country, doing better. And what's interesting about this is that this runs counter to what we've seen for most of the pandemic. When we began the pandemic in March and April especially of last year, the northeastern states were really the ones that were hit the hardest by far. Early in the pandemic, we had about 80% of the deaths concentrated in about a 75-mile wide corridor that ran from Boston to Washington, D.C. It's a geographic area that makes up less than 1% of the area of the country, and it accounted for about 80% of the deaths. And it really looked like it was because, number one, it's a concentrated population, and number two, it's cold, and people were spending time indoors. And then we got into the milder spring months, and we saw that really across the country, where the weather's pretty mild everywhere by the time we get into late May, the pandemic had subsided for a brief period of about a month. But then as we got into the hotter months in June, then the pandemic really took off in the hot southern states, and it really looked like as people went indoors for the air conditioning. And so really we've seen this kind of regional and seemingly weather-oriented pattern of where the pandemic has been going. But now what we're seeing is that in the states that are the absolute coldest, the bitter cold in the upper Midwest, that's where the pandemic is subsiding. And so it seems like that doesn't really make any sense. So what's the cause of that? Well, let's take a step back and just kind of look at where has the pandemic been going in terms of this decrease. And I think what we were thinking was that as we got through the Christmas holiday and people had gotten together and moved into New Year's, that we were going to see a big increase coming out of New Year's. But instead, what we saw was a big decrease. We saw a slight increase that was very short-lived after New Year's, and then we began this really strong decrease. And so that's a little bit of a mystery, but it looks like what was going on was that back in mid-November, we started to see a decrease, but then everybody got together for Thanksgiving and we had an increase. And then by the time we got to early to mid-December, we were back to kind of the normal pattern, and we started to see a decrease again. But then everyone got together for the Christmas holidays and we saw an increase. But now that this holiday period is over, now we're back to seeing the decrease. And so what this looks like to me, my best guess is that we would have actually had a decrease starting about mid-November if we hadn't had these people getting together in the holiday get-togethers and sharing the virus and causing what looked like fairly short-lived spikes in the positive tests. And so if we kind of reframe our point of reference from saying, why is the situation improving now, to saying, well, if it really began improving in mid-November, except that we kind of thwarted it for a month and a half or so, then I think that changes the picture a little bit. So I think an easier question to ask than why is the pandemic decreasing is, well, why did infections increase? The answer is because people were getting together for the holidays. That seems pretty straightforward to me. Then I think we can then answer the question of why they were decreasing by saying that it looked like they were already decreasing in mid-November, except for the fact that we thwarted them. So my operating theory at this point is that the reason infections are decreasing in the upper Midwest is that it's just so cold and it can be difficult to travel. And thanks to some comments on my LinkedIn feed for that suggestion. But if people have to go outside and scrape ice off their cars and then drive on icy roads in order to get together, maybe they get together a little bit less. Whereas if you're in a more densely populated area and maybe you can walk to visit friends or get together, maybe people get together a little bit more. And I think that actually could explain why we're seeing the decrease sooner in these upper Midwestern states than we are seeing in the states that were hit the hardest last year. So that's really it for the briefing this week. There's always more information. You can access on my website at stevemcconnell.com/CovidComplete, or if you prefer, you can go to CovidComplete.org that goes to the same site. Thanks for joining me, and stay safe.